Okay, everybody, welcome to the program. This is the Otherppl Show. I am Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. Thanks for listening. Hope you're okay out there. Happy Sunday. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button wherever you listen, and you can follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky. I have a special episode for you today. I'm going to be sharing a sneak preview of How to Write Autobiographical Fiction, a brand new course from DeepDive that is taught by acclaimed writer Hannah Pittard. She is the author of several novels, including Listen to Me, The Fates Will Find Their Way, and most recently, a work of autofiction called If You Love It, Let It Kill You. So How to Write Autobiographical Fiction is a new course from DeepDive, and for the uninitiated, DeepDive is my company. It's a new company that I founded earlier this year. It produces in-depth courses. It's an education company. And the debut course from DeepDive was released earlier this year. It is called How to Write a Novel, and it's sort of the flagship course from DeepDive. It is available right now. It's more than 50 hours in length, and it features instruction from nearly 4 dozen of today's most celebrated contemporary authors. And then How to Write Autobiographical Fiction is the new course, which is coming out soon, and it is what I would refer to as an intensive. It is a shorter format course. It's all about autobiographical fiction, so it's very focused. It's about what autobiographical fiction is, what it is not, how it differs from memoir, how to shape persona and voice on the page, how to handle the ethical challenges of writing about real people, how to revise autobiographical fiction effectively, and then how to take your work out into the world. Along the way, Hannah shares a lot of personal stories and practical advice that will help you learn how to transform your lived experience into art. I should add that the course also features conversations with Michael Wheaton, founder of Autofocus Books, an independent press devoted to publishing autobiographical writing. So you'll hear from Hannah, and she's the main teacher, and she's an author who works in this mode, but you'll also hear from Michael Wheaton so that you can get a publisher's perspective. How to Write Autobiographical Fiction is launching just a couple of days from now. It will officially be available on October 1st, 2025, exclusively from DeepDive. You'll be able to stream it online, or better yet, in the DeepDive app, which is available for both iPhone and Android. And please note that when you enroll, you gain access to the DeepDive community where you can ask questions, share work, and connect with other writers right there in the app. So it's all very exciting. How to Write Autobiographical Fiction coming out on October 1st. And today I'm going to be sharing with you the very first episode from the course, one of my conversations with Hannah Pittard, and I hope you enjoy it. So let's get started with today's sneak preview. Here is episode 1 from the new DeepDive course, How to Write Autobiographical Fiction, with Hannah Pittard. Okay, welcome to How to Write Autobiographical Fiction, a DeepDive course taught by acclaimed novelist Hannah Pittard. In this first episode, we will set the stage by asking some fundamental questions like, what is autobiographical fiction? And how is it different from memoir or autobiography? And why are so many writers drawn to it? Why do so many writers use their own lives as the raw material for their art? Hannah Pittard is a celebrated writer of autobiographical fiction, or autofiction, as it is commonly known. She is someone who has traveled this road, and she speaks very eloquently to the challenges and rewards presented to writers who choose to work in this vein. I spoke with Hannah in episode 980 of the Otherppl podcast as she was celebrating the publication of her novel, If You Love It, Let It Kill You. If You Love It, Let It Kill You is a work of autofiction, and it is, in a loose sort of way, a kind of fictional companion piece to Hannah's critically acclaimed memoir entitled We Are Too Many. We Are Too Many is about Hannah's marriage and how it ended when her husband had an affair with her best friend. So, the messy stuff of life, very difficult and delicate and deeply personal and painful subject matter, but it's also the stuff of great literature. So, If You Love It, Let It Kill You is once again a work of autofiction. The main character is named Hannah. She is a novelist, and the story begins with Hannah learning that an unflattering version of herself will soon appear prominently in her ex-husband's debut novel. Here, I should mention that some version of this actually did happen to Hannah in real life, and as you are about to hear, it then became the point of genesis for her novel. Here I am, talking with Hannah Pittard in episode 980 of the Otherppl podcast.
I had just sort of wrapped up edits on my memoir, and for uninteresting reasons, we were late to announce the book, to get it in Publishers Marketplace. And the day that we were finally, part of it was because we were going back and forth on the title, and we didn't want to announce without having, the proper, the title that we were sticking with. On the day that we were supposed to announce, I got this email from my agent. Subject line was, "Have you seen this?" Never like a good sign, by the way. It was just so ominous that she communicates by way of subject line. But it was, "Have you seen this?" I clicked it open, and the entire text was just a screenshot of my ex-husband's debut, the announcement for his debut novel. And I read it with great interest, this synopsis. And the synopsis was essentially the plot of our divorce, his infidelity. And it even included the fact that his soon-to-be ex-wife was about to publish a work of autofiction, which I was conflating with my memoir. I thought, oh my gosh, this is insane. So obviously I read this announcement with great interest and curiosity, certain amount of annoyance. And I did something that I hadn't done in like 6 or 7 years. I Googled him. I was looking for any kind of news that I could find about this novel that I had never, I had no inkling was in the works. And I couldn't find anything about the book, but I did find a short story that he'd written and published in 2019. And in the short story, there is a person who's a lot like him. There's a woman who's a lot like me. They've gotten a divorce because he's cheated with the woman's best friend. The woman who's a lot like me is dating the chair of the English department and is helping to raise his daughter. All of this checks out with my life. And so I read this story with even greater interest than I had the announcement to the debut. And I was completely unprepared for the part where in the story, the me person gets knifed to death by a homeless man. and that was really, I got to that moment and I was like, wait, what now? And I had to reread that section. And then I reread the whole story. And I was like, son of a biscuit.
Yeah.
This guy murdered me, which I thought was hilarious, vaguely disturbing. And I started using it as a punchline immediately, told my boyfriend who was sitting across from me, I was like, guess who wrote a story about us and guess who murdered me? And, as I told people, certain people found it as amusing or not as amusing as I did. I have a friend, a poet friend who was pretty upset by it. My sister thought it was hilarious. My boyfriend was like, I don't like that. And I said, do you want to read the story? And he said, no. But that was the day that I started writing If You Love It, Let It Kill You. I didn't know that I was working on a novel, but I just thought, I'm a middle-aged, mid-list novelist who just found out that 3 years ago she was murdered and she had no idea. And I just kind of took the story and ran with it.
Okay, that was Hannah Pittard talking with me in episode 980 of the Otherppl podcast. She was telling me the origin story of her novel, If You Love It, Let It Kill You, and she was talking about the ways in which the deeply personal and the very complicated can often find their way into a work of fiction. A reminder that episode 980 is available in its entirety in the bonus materials for this course. And in the dialogue ahead, you will hear Hannah and I talk through key definitions, common misconceptions, and creative possibilities that open up when you blur the line between truth and invention. We'll look at why identity itself can become a drama on the page, how memory shapes narrative, and why giving yourself permission to deviate from fact can often bring you closer to emotional truth. Hannah and I will also explore the risks and rewards of writing autobiographical fiction, the vulnerability that it demands, the potential that it carries for misunderstanding, and the deeper self-knowledge that can often emerge from the process. Along the way, Hannah will share some insights from her own career, including what led her to this form, and why she believes that greater personal risk on the page often leads to greater artistic reward. By the end of this conversation, I think you're going to have a deeper sense of what autobiographical fiction is, what it is not, and how you might begin to approach it in your own work. So let's get started. Here I am with Hannah Pittard. So I think a good place for us to begin is with definitions. Like, let's just get this defined, because there's some confusion, I think, sometimes between like autofiction and autobiographical or autobiography or autobiographical novel. Like, are there distinctions? Is it all the same? Like, how do we define these terms?
Well, I think we know what an autobiography is, right? An autobiography is the story of a person's life. It's not even a memoir, right? A memoir is going to be usually about a particular moment or defining event in a person's life. And then you've got the autobiography, which tells, a really in-depth, usually linear story of a person and what they've accomplished. It usually has to do with accomplishments, right? But then you've got the autobiographical novel, and I think that there are an overwhelming number of these. A lot of debut novelists begin with what they know, and what they know is themselves, but they think of it as pure fiction, even though they're drawing a lot from their life experiences. Whereas I think of autofiction as a very intentional culling of the writer's life and using that material for art in a kind of performative aspect.
Are there misconceptions about autofiction that writers should be wary of? Are there things that people miss or things that people misconstrue when it comes to like defining these terms and then approaching this kind of work creatively?
Well, I think that certainly there are readers and critics who would accuse autofiction as being not too much more than navel gazing, that it's just self-examination for the sake of self-examination, or worse, self-examination for lack of imagination. And I do think that early writers of autofiction can get caught in that trap of perhaps just using the genre as a means to journal publicly. And I don't think that is what autofiction is. I don't think it's about navel gazing. I don't think it is self-examination in lieu of imagination. I think, in fact, it is very much for the writer and the audience who feels that identity itself is a struggle and a drama, a daily drama. And so I think that it is very much for a writer who is interested in examining what it is to be an individual with an identity. And I think it's a lot of the books that I've read, it seems like something in common that they all have is a desire to pick apart and question the daily choices and performances that we all make. Everybody, whether you're a writer or not, you are donning a character every day.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that I feel like there is a tension that I notice, like in the Otherppl show and just in my conversations with writers in person over the years, between people who might work in a quote unquote more imaginative mode, where they're just inventing whole cloth characters and situations and even places, versus people who might work in a more autofictional mode. And what I will hear, kind of usually implicitly rather than explicitly, is that one is better than the other. So like the super imaginative writers will kind of like subtly diss like writers of autofiction as not maybe writing fiction in the way that fiction should be written, or maybe not taking on a challenge that, the writers who are operating imaginatively do, and vice versa. You'll have autofiction writers, I think, kind of subtly diss these other writers for not maybe having as much personal risk on the page as a writer of autofiction, and not really implicating themselves and maybe hiding behind characters and all this stuff. And I feel like these tensions and arguments get a little bit tiresome. I just want to say, I think it's all fine. Like, I think it's just a matter of personal preference. And if it's done well, it's worthy of being in print, and it can be a wonderful reading experience. Do you have different feelings?
No, I definitely, I'm a both and, not an either or as well. I happen to be at a stage in my writing life where autofiction is very interesting to me. And it could just be, for me, it might be anything from being over 40 to a kind of instinctive response to the publishing industry. I think identity has become more important than ever. At least it feels that way to me. I'm sure that, 100 years ago, somebody else might have said that. But as a writer who has been doing this for about 20 years, I feel like there's this desire from audience members, from readers, from editors, that the author be more publicly available. And so I think because I have been asked to show more of myself and become more vulnerable off the page, I very much wanted to incorporate that kind of request, that external request. I've wanted to incorporate that into my writing, because it affects the way I'm thinking about writing, and it affects the way I'm presenting myself. And so it's a bit of, the snake eating its tail. It's like, it's all part of the same thing a little bit.
And it's not new.
Oh gosh, no. This has been around since, ancient Greece. It's Sappho has been sort of identified as a very early autofiction writer. Tolstoy, Roth would have pushed against it and did push against it. And yet he was very much mining his life for material, very closely mining his life for material. So no, it's not new at all.
And I feel like there is some question about this line between autofiction and memoir, and like, what are the key distinctions? Because, James Fry being a very public example of somebody who got caught fictionalizing a memoir, it was really overt fictionalizing. It wasn't just like, oh, I forgot some names, or I messed up a situation, the timing of it or the chronology. Like, it was completely invented and presented as something that had actually happened. And, that said, I do think that anybody writing a memoir is essentially writing autofiction, because the memory is so spotty. I mean, I think you can make that argument. But how do you parse it?
Yeah, I agree with you, though, that you can make that argument, because the minute, even if you're sitting down to write a memoir, it is not meant to be made up in any way. The minute there's any distance that you have from the event that you're writing about, that distance is morphing your perception of what happened. There have been studies done on what people can accurately recall 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours later. And it's fascinating how quickly the brain can rewrite something, and you can absolutely believe that the dress you wore on a Tuesday night was red until somebody presents you, with, well, now they could present you with any kind of evidence and you still wouldn't know because AI exists. But pre-AI, somebody could then present you with a photo of you in the blue dress on Tuesday, and your memory still tells you that you were in the red dress, but you're looking at a picture that says your memory is flawed. And I would think, honestly, the best memoir would manage to incorporate all of that, my perception, and then what happened when I was confronted with actual facts. And perhaps it would even include some sort of analysis of why I thought my brain switched me into a red dress. What did that have to do with my fantasy or with my hopes and dreams or with my recollection of a particular moment? But I think ultimately memoir, when you sit down to write a memoir, you are promising the reader that what you are trying to do is be honest. You are trying to capture something honest, and I don't know if true is the right word there because, that's such a complicated idea, but you're not trying to trick anyone. You're trying to get to the heart of a particular matter. And I wouldn't say that autofiction is a trick, but I think that the exploration is different. It involves more of the writer's interior life, the writer's fantasy, I think it's a genre that allows a writer to explore dangerous territory. A lot of what ifs. What if I had a different life? What if this disaster befell my family? What might I do then? So you're allowing yourself permission to imagine yourself in sort of other worlds. And then you're performing that imagination for the reader, and you're inviting them along on this somewhat dangerous, somewhat vulnerable bit of voyeurism.
What I always say is that my memory isn't good enough to do a memoir unless I've kept like a really meticulous diary. So if I'm opting for autofiction, a lot of times it's because I feel like it's the only way. Like I can't remember. So I can remember some stuff, but I can't remember everything. And I like to give myself the latitude to invent. I think maybe because it's more interesting and exciting for me creatively, but also what I have found is that it's the only way to make the book work a lot of times. Like some of the stuff is pretty close to the bone and pretty much as is, but there are passages in my most recent book that I can recall being like, okay, I've got to make some stuff up here just to keep this thing rolling and like to make it cohere.
Absolutely. And honestly, I think one of the great beauties of autofiction is the tension that you can cause in a reader, the tension of not knowing what's real and what's not real. I mean, in an ideal world, a work of autofiction would be a satisfying read, whether or not the audience member knew that it was autofiction, that they should be able to sit down and think, this is a novel and it's still entertaining. But if you are aware that the author is using themselves as, fodder, very intentional fodder, then I think there can be this kind of halo of excitement, in the reader as they try to figure out, is this real? Is this not real? Like what did Brad have to put in here to make it interesting? And what did Brad accidentally put in here? And what did Brad put in here that he wants us to think is not real, but actually is real? All of that's very exciting to me.
Yeah, me too. That's like the beauty of reading autofiction. And I guess it's a matter of personal taste, but I just really love when you can feel palpably that personal risk and that willingness to disclose and that willingness to kind of live openly on the page. I find it to be when it's done well, I find it to be very exciting. I also find it to be an enormous relief as a human being.
I agree. I am somebody who is, and this will be somewhat surprising, perhaps, unless you do what we do. But I think of myself as an incredibly private person, and that I live a very guarded, sort of secondary life in my head and in my imagination. And strangely, this genre of autofiction, I mean, I'm riffing on your use of the word relief. There's this capacity for, and this desire to share through the written word that I don't have to share with somebody who might be right in front of me, but I'm willing to, put it down in writing, wait the year and a half it takes to have it published. And then there's this kind of distance that's safe, but I still feel as though I've done something, that isn't necessarily comfortable to me and is therefore sort of provocative and new and challenging.
So I think what you're speaking to is why we do this, because there can be costs that you incur. I think this is maybe the case with any creative project. Any book that you write is going to cost you something, right? But with autofiction, it can sometimes exact a more personal cost. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on why a certain subset of writers are drawn to this kind of work versus maybe more traditional approaches to fiction.
I think I'm only able to speak to why I'm drawn to it. And for me, it is because I maxed out what I could do with traditional fiction. I did it. I wrote short stories, and then I wrote a debut novel, and I invented characters, and I invented scenes, and I invented situations. And I did that for 4 novels worth. And each of those novels, for me, I did something different. I intentionally, I love playing with time. I love playing with alinear narratives. And so for each of the books, I made myself do something different. The first book spans 40 years. The second book spans 4 days. The third book spans 4 months, right? So each time I'm limiting myself, or I'm pushing myself to do something new. And I think by the time I finished the 4th book, I felt as though I'd pushed myself through that traditional genre as much as I could, and I was ready to do something new. And of course, before I moved to autofiction, I did write a memoir, and the memoir was very satisfying. And in fact, it was such a change, and it felt like I was building a new muscle as a writer. But so that when I finished it, I was very interested in continuing to study me and to study my identity. But I had maxed out on memoir. I wrote about one of the defining moments in my life, and there aren't any others. So the natural trajectory was autofiction, where I could continue my self-examination, but also continue to grow and flex my muscles as a writer and my sort of instinctive dormant muscles as a fiction writer.
Yeah. And I feel like something that maybe doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to writing autofiction is the reward that you get in terms of self-knowledge. I guess I'm only speaking for myself, but I would imagine that most people who do this work derive some kind of similar benefit, because if you spend the amount of time and energy and effort that one must spend in order to complete a book-length project, and you are in good faith sitting down and trying to engage in self-exploration on the page, and to really carefully examine who you are or who you think you are, right? This issue of identity and how slippery it is, and maybe to examine certain psychological, even spiritual difficulties that you might be reckoning with, life events, traumas, all the kind of stuff that goes into autofiction. What I find is that, one of the deepest rewards, if not the deepest reward of the process, is that, you come away with it with, I think, maybe a deeper understanding of self. Maybe hopefully you take yourself a little bit less seriously. I think in the aggregate, there is some kind of therapeutic benefit. I mean, that's not maybe the primary motivation for doing this work, but I think there can be that effect. Is that how you see it?
I think that there absolutely can be that effect. And it is certainly my experience as well, that at least on the other side of writing my most recent novel, which is a work of autofiction, there is an epiphany that my persona has in the final chapter on the final page. And the epiphany that she has 100% happened in live time as I was writing that book. I had the epiphany, and it was, I think I even used this expression on the last page, but it was sit up in bed, light bulb above the head epiphany. And I don't necessarily want to give it away. And it's not even a large epiphany, but it's one that I had while I was writing the book. It matched what my character's arc was. And on the other side of it, I did feel, coming back to that word relief, I felt great relief. And it wasn't what I was going for. It wasn't what I was after. I was not looking for therapy from this book, but absolutely there was sort of a happy coincidence in the aftermath. I did feel calmer, and I felt very satisfied with where I'd landed, where my character had landed, and also where I had landed emotionally, sort of spiritually.
It feels good to get that stuff out. And I feel like maybe the level of satisfaction that you're talking about might be commensurate with the level of risk, like personal risk that there is on the page. It feels like the more that you quote unquote, go there in a work of autofiction, the more blood there is on the page, as I like to say. Maybe, if you execute well, the end result is that maybe that feeling of deeper satisfaction or that sense of like peace or self-knowledge that you can derive from having gone through what can be a really arduous process, because a lot of times autofiction is confessional. As we've been saying, it's obviously very self-exploratory. It can be an expression of resistance. It can be an expression of personal reinvention. There's a lot of autofiction where it's somebody in recovery from some kind of trauma. I guess maybe a question that a listener might have who is at the outset of a project like this or is contemplating a project like this is the risk-reward ratio. And you mentioned earlier that you're a very private person, and, maybe some of the things that you do on the page don't necessarily match up with how you are, like IRL. And I think I'm kind of the same way. And yet I think where I've come to, both as a reader, maybe first as a reader and then as a writer, is that it's like, oh, I don't think don't be afraid. It doesn't really matter. It's just a book. and I mean, I don't mean to be too fatalistic here, but like, we're all going to die. Like, just be honest. You know what I'm saying? Just go there. Like, if somebody you don't want to intentionally try to harm somebody, but if you're operating in good faith and trying to work through your version of the truth, and you're like earnestly trying to get to the heart of the matter, and then it goes out into the world, and maybe there will be some level of self-exposure, and it's a real intimacy, and it's a real risk, but it's not the end of the world. Like, I have never experienced any kind of fallout that has given me pause in terms of working in this mode, nor have I ever, I know there are some examples of people who like get sued or have some sort of, familial rupture. It's not like that kind of stuff can't happen, but I don't think it's all that common. I think most people understand that when a writer takes the time to write a book, they're trying their best, and they've got to kind of deal with messy stuff, and it's their take, and it lives between the covers of that book, and that's that.
Well, here's the other thing about, risk reward. I can guarantee you, absolutely guarantee you, that you will be misperceived. It doesn't matter how safe or not safe you're being with your writing. You will at some point be misperceived and misunderstood. And the sooner you can come to terms with that as a writer, that you cannot control how this document that you've created all alone and sent out into the world, that you cannot control how it is going to be received. The freedom that comes with coming to terms with that and being okay with that really allows you to take more chances, because the truth is, it doesn't matter how safe you're being. Somebody is going to misunderstand you. And you can either choose to be frustrated and defensive, or you can say, not my ideal reader, right? Like, because you also cannot write to please everyone. You just can't. I mean, going back to what you said a couple minutes ago, that you've interviewed so many writers, right? Like, more writers than I bet a lot of people out there. You've got your show is just, it's epic and it's deep. The list is very deep. And you said, it feels almost like 50-50, that there are these two different types of writers. So if you think, even in a community of writers, if there is this divide, you just have to let it go and do what you want to do, write what you want to write, but I absolutely believe that the bigger the risk, the bigger the possibility of a reward. And, there's nothing wrong with being ambitious and failing. And in fact, I think one of the meanest things I can say in a workshop to a writer is, oh yeah, I think this story set out to accomplish everything it wanted to accomplish. Like, how unsatisfying is that? That just means you didn't try for enough stuff. Like, nothing is perfect. And now I'm worried that one of my students might listen to this and say, oh, wait a minute. But I wouldn't want to hear that either. I wouldn't want to hear somebody say, wow, this book did, it crossed every single T and dotted all of those I's. And yep, it just really hit the level it wanted to hit.
Something that you just said made me think of the ways in which autofiction can sometimes create fallout or can make the author maybe a subject of fascination that he or she otherwise would not be, because the author is so implicated in the story and on the page. And if there is this kind of fallout or any kind of controversy, that can be good when it comes to book publicity and trying to kind of break through the noise and find readers. Like, that's certainly the case for me. If I hear about a book of this kind and there's some kind of buzz around it in that way, that's going to pique my interest.
Absolutely. And, I think I've been on the receiving end of that kind of publicity. I remember after my memoir came out and just before my ex-husband's debut novel came out, which very much was using the material of our divorce and his affair, I got a call from Adam Ross, who has edited my work in the past. And Adam said, are you ready to become the story? And for a moment, I felt implicated in this way that made me very, very uncomfortable. And then immediately on the other side of that, I thought, well, I can't control it, right? I either am part of the story or I'm not part of the story. But on the plus side, for me, the more people who want me as part of the story, the more my work is going to be in their hands and in the world. And certainly there can be some publicity on the other side of, these wars between public figures and within autofiction.
One of the most obvious pros when it comes to writing autofiction is that you're an expert on the material, or you're as much of an expert as anyone could be. Nobody knows your story and the stuff of your life better than you do. And I think another pro that maybe doesn't get talked about as much as it should is that when it comes to this issue of risk on the page, which I think is such a necessity if you want to be a good writer of autofiction, is that if you have the courage, the creative courage to go there and to really risk, that will often end up eliciting more feeling in a reader. And this issue of feeling and this issue of emotion on the reading end of the equation, I can't emphasize it enough because I think it's so important. It's what I go to books for, or it's the thing that I think I most appreciate in a reading experience. Like, I want to feel something. And so I just want to underline that, like feeling and emotion, like trying to elicit feeling and emotion in a reader. It should be one of the primary objectives of anybody writing any kind of fiction, and maybe especially somebody writing autofiction.
I think that's right. And I would say, and I'm sure I've said this to you before, and if not, I just say it to myself all the time. All the things a listener right now might be thinking, but how do I get to that emotional truth? How do I know what the right thing is to admit to or confess to or acknowledge? And there's no necessarily right or wrong answer to that, or there's no guaranteed pathway to find the words or the language or the admission that will make your reader's body temperature rise or change. But I can say this as somebody, I am in the classroom, every year with hundreds, and sometimes, depending on what classes I'm teaching, thousands of 18 to 22-year-olds. And all of the things that my students think they shouldn't say aloud, it's usually those things that when they finally write them down, elicit the strongest and most complimentary reactions, that there are connections made because their peers read something and they say, I didn't know anyone else felt like that, or I didn't know we were allowed to say that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that all the things you think you shouldn't say, I do think you should write them down. It doesn't necessarily mean all of those things are going to ultimately end up in the final document or should ever be shared. But it is worth forcing yourself as a writer to start making lists of the things that you are keeping secret or that you are ashamed of, or that for some reason or other, there's some emotion that makes you not want to acknowledge this particular, feeling that you have inside. Write it down and wonder, why do I not want to acknowledge that? And then press on it even more and ask yourself, is it really possible that nobody else feels like this, that they don't have this shame or this vulnerability or this fear or this weakness? And it is, I just 99% of the time, it's that stuff that we're so embarrassed by that is ultimately going to provide a kind of bridge between you and your best reader.
And there are obvious cons, when it comes to the pros and cons of writing autofiction. I think maybe, the obvious one is that, you are the material, and so are the people who are closest to you most of the time, right? So you're going to implicate people you know and probably people you love, and that can sometimes get tricky. How do you navigate that?
Well, I think, so here's something, and this is going to sound like a really bad armchair analysis perhaps, but my feeling is this: what you write about the people who are close to you, it has the opportunity to create rifts and tension. I believe this. If the rift and tension cannot be fixed on the other side of it, then that relationship probably had a devastating flaw before you wrote anything down. And on the other hand, perhaps writing about something will provide a means or a method by which you can get on the other side of it with somebody, right? Like perhaps something that I've written will infuriate my father. I absolutely believe that on the other side of having infuriated him, we can find something that is even closer and more authentic in our relationship, because I finally articulated some anger I might have had loitering, and he got to articulate his frustration, and it was my writing that allowed us to get there. On the other hand, perhaps I have an aunt who read my second book and wrote me a 5-page typed single-space letter articulating everything that was wrong with me, my brother, my sister, and my entire family. And perhaps that was the last time I ever heard from that aunt. I'm okay with that. That was not a relationship that was strong to begin with, and it was clearly not one that I needed to bring into the next several decades of my life, hypothetically speaking, Brad.
Yeah, I think in fact, I would say all of my experiences with people close to me who have been implicated in my books have been fine, more or less. Maybe a little bit of discomfort or a little bit of, but I think if you're operating in good faith and just trying to get to the truth and trying to express, and this is a key distinction, I think, with autofiction, is that it's not factual truth. It's emotional truth, which I think is primary. There's some factual truth in it, but ultimately what you're working towards is an emotional truth. And if you're doing that work in good faith, even if the person on the receiving end or the person who's implicated doesn't necessarily agree, I think that most reasonable people understand. And if they don't understand, I don't know. You can try to explain it to them, but you might just have to let them be upset about it for a week and then just move on.
Absolutely. And just to put a cap on that, if you're sitting down and using autofiction as a means to shoot fish in a barrel, then there should be fallout and people are going to be mad. But if you're sitting down, like you've said, and you are looking for emotional truth, and what I like to say is if you're sitting down and you're looking up at the world, if you're trying to find the beauty of it, if you're trying to make connections, then there probably isn't going to be significant fallout. But yeah, if you're sitting down to be mean and to be a jerk and to get back at somebody, then
it's probably not going to be a good book.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
that can't be, unless you're really just somebody who can operate from anger, like I think there are vanishingly few, but there are some writers that I've read who I'm like, wow, this person really writes well when they're enraged. They're able to channel it. And I think that's a tough one. That's a tough, tightrope walk. And I think that, another con that I want to touch on before we end is that there can be, I think, in the writer of autofiction, this impulse to want to hew closely to the truth, right? Like to try to render it. There is a memoiristic impulse that's sort of embedded inside of the autofictional impulse. And it's a mistake. Yes, in certain instances, you do want to hew closely to the truth because that serves the novel that you're writing best. But it's really important to remember that it's not necessary. And you have to become skilled at discerning when to do one and when to do the other.
Absolutely.
We feel this weird fidelity to events as we remember them, and it can feel maybe like a betrayal. I think that's the issue, is that people feel like, oh, I'm betraying the experience that I went through, or I'm betraying myself, or I'm betraying the people who were involved in this thing. If you're going to be writing autofiction, emphasis on the word, on fiction, you have to give yourself permission to deviate.
As an example, just think about how you tell a funny story that happened to you yesterday. You're sitting down at a dinner table with 10 of your closest friends and something hilarious happened, let's say on your way to get a colonoscopy. You don't start with, well, in the morning I had oatmeal. Well, of course you wouldn't be having oatmeal because you're on your way to get a colonoscopy, but you don't start with, I woke up at 6 a.m. and there were birds chirping. And then I went downstairs and then I came back upstairs and I brushed my teeth twice. And then I forgot to floss. I'm bored already, right? When we tell stories, it is our instinct to condense, to distill, to leave out what's unnecessary. And then if we're fiction writers, we embellish, right? And we put a gloss on something and we basically, highlight it and put it in bold, and then maybe you rearrange it. So there's an art to telling stories, true stories. And you just have to remember that even when we're telling the truth, we leave things out. And certainly when we're telling autofiction, we have to be able to leave, the facts of the matter behind and seek something else. Like you keep saying, this higher emotional truth. What are we after? What is the point? It cannot simply be like a journalistic dump.
So the last thing I want to touch on is the tension that exists in this, not knowing what the capital T truth is. It's a subjective process writing autofiction is. And I think that there are implications that an autofictional approach offers a writer when it comes to plot. I think that autofiction, in my reading of it anyway, tends to be a bit different than maybe more traditional novels when it comes to plotting and the ways in which a story in this vein can be propulsive. I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about that part of it, because I do feel like it is markedly different in some respects.
Well, certainly no one would accuse me of being a plot forward writer ever. I have always been drawn to voice and style. And what I love about autofiction and using that tension of not knowing what's real, creating that tension in the reader, what I am doing in part is creating a different momentum. I'm getting readers to turn the page, in part because they're trying to figure, the quote unquote me of it out, to figure the quote unquote reality of it out, rather than looking for the next step in a plot.
Okay, that was Hannah Pittard talking with me about the fundamentals of autobiographical fiction. Let's now take a moment to review the conversation and go over what we just learned. Hannah first helped us clarify some important definitions. We looked at the distinctions between autobiography, memoir, and the autobiographical novel. We talked about why memory is always subjective. and why that makes any first-person storytelling inherently a mix of fact and imagination. Hannah also talked about some of the misconceptions around autofiction. For example, that it's just navel-gazing or that it lacks in imagination. She talked about why autofiction can actually be a powerful genre for writers who want to interrogate identity and put personal risk on the page. We also talked about the risks and rewards of writing in this mode, the vulnerability that it requires, the possibility of implicating people close to you, and the creative freedom that comes from realizing that you can't control how others will perceive your work. When it comes to writing autofiction of your own, remember, give yourself permission to blur fact and fiction. Don't feel bound to strict accuracy. That's a mistake. Aim instead for emotional truth. Also, remember that the moments you most resist putting down on the page are often the ones that carry the most power. So, shame, vulnerability, secrecy, these are the things that create the strongest connections with readers 9 times out of 10. Finally, remember to utilize the tension between what's real and what's imagined, and use this tension to give your story momentum. This kind of uncertainty is part of the fun of reading autofiction, and it can keep readers engaged every bit as much as a traditional plot. Let your life provide the raw material, but don't be afraid to reshape it in pursuit of something larger. So, a great first conversation with Hannah Pittard. Once again, she is the author of several acclaimed novels, including If You Love It, Let It Kill You. Thank you very much for listening. All key links and information can be found in the show notes. And the next episode is ready when you are. Okay, there we go. That was the first episode from How to Write Autobiographical Fiction with Hannah Pittard. The entire course will be available on October 1st from DeepDive. For more information, just go to www.deepdive.audio. How to Write Autobiographical Fiction is designed to give you the tools and the confidence to take the stuff of your life and then transform it into fiction that is resonant and powerful. So one more time, How to Write Autobiographical Fiction launches on October 1st. Thank you for listening to the preview. Thanks to Hannah Pittard. And I hope you'll join us on Deep Dive on October 1st. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. Hit that subscribe button. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky. Sign up for my newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. Support the show at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Get an Other People t-shirt and join the Other People book club at otherppl.com. And if you have 2 minutes and you want to help me out, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Rate it, review it. It helps the show in the algorithm, and it helps it find new listeners. Okay, so coming up on Tuesday, I will be back with a traditional Other People episode, an author interview. I'm going to be talking with Jason Diamond. His debut novel is out right now. It is winning all kinds of rave reviews. It is called Kaplan's Plot. I had a great talk with Jason Diamond, and that is coming up on Tuesday. Stay tuned.